Is this working? I'll thank ARCASIA for having given me this opportunity to share my thoughts. I am no social scientist. However, the topic or the theme identified makes it imperative for me to start with talking about the notion of modernity, without which I don't think any talk on urban design to address in a modern world would make sense. So with my limited knowledge on the social sciences, I'll be probably making some broad generalizations of the evolution of the concept of modernity in our context, which I think would make the fundamental difference. I would try and be as structured as possible. I have divided my talk into first where I build up the concepts on modernity. Second is the idea of the public realm as being the arena for urban design to happen. And then I start talking about the characteristics or qualities in the urban situation which impinge upon or surface up to be able to start making a difference to the modernity, whether defining or shifting directions or orientations. And finally, I'll conclude, therefore, the resulting urban design agenda. However much I try to be organized, given the kind of concept of modernity that we have, which is not only elusive, but also seems to be in a fluid state where it needs constant redefinition. And to be able to, and architecture and urban design does not precede revolution. See, these concepts start coming up, how urban design would tend to respond would really depend on the gap between our understanding and the ability to be able to respond in terms of a manifestation. So I must confess that the talk could be a little non-linear and could take jumps. So just bear with me and I'll take you along. There will be a lot of visuals, so in some cases I'll really go fast because the time given is extremely limited. But please look at the visuals as conveying a conception and not as an end. So I start from the beginning. And I think the major difference was when the colonists came in, and I think that's where the difference started coming. So very briefly, maybe all of this is known, but still to create a ground for my talk, the colonists considered the native population as uncivilized and uncouth, and therefore the reason to control, regulate them, and Indian towns were considered chaotic, crowded, and unhygienic. Spatial segregation became synonymous with status and security. So more the distance, higher is my status. Their notion of modernity was merely not about health and hygiene, but also about order, beauty, and management. To be modern was prerogative of the colonist, who claimed the right to define its meaning and assert its manifest. So the natives did not have a right to be able to have ever reached their idea of what is being modern. So one would keep trying, so they could aspire, they can seek, they can adopt, they can mimic the identified modern forms, but they'll never achieve it, was the colonist stand very clearly of what is modern. So the modern was defined, was given, to which you have no choice but to succumb to it and aspire towards it. And a clear case of the contrast, I've taken just an example of Delhi, the contrast between the native town and the colonial town. The concern, as you see, and all the points that I made are quite obvious here in terms of distance becoming desirable. So you start having the bungalow type as against the typology in the Shahjahanabad, the older city, the dense fabric, the idea of a plot and a house within a plot, the firing distance as a means of segregating the natives from the colonists. The colonists were always threatened about the presence of the native if they are too close to their residential areas. And therefore, the modernity, the conception is not linear, as against the European concept where post-industrial, everything was something which moved in a linear fashion. in India, the idea of modernity was not linear. And I think that's what I'm going to try and tell you, which makes all the difference to the way we tackle urban design. So the dichotomous approach of rural versus urban was, again, a colonist ploy or a strategy. This resulted in urban being synonymous with economic progress and rural being a repository of culture and tradition. So straight away, the dichotomous conception was already, the divide was created, and it was quite clear where you ought to belong. The village was regarded as the authentic repository of timeless values and virtues of Indian civilization, whereas the modern city was viewed with profound ambivalence as a spurious Western implant. You know, even now, my state also, you really don't know which side to take and how much of what. And I think that kind of an ambivalent situation continues even today, and that's where we see a lot of resulting problems in the urban design approaches. And believe me, India was really never urban. Up to Mughal and probably the early part of the colonists who tackled urban and the civic gestures, the post-independence, there was nothing urban about the whole thing. All the representatives, elected representatives, used to sit in the cities, but their concern was always the village. There was nothing urban about the first 30 years after independence, nothing about so-called urban. And importantly, the urban development activity came under the Ministry of Health. And the Ministry of Urban Development was formed in 1985. So you can imagine the entire concern of what urban development, which took off from the concern for hygiene, health, order. I think that point comes out quite clear. Therefore, the question is India really urban? And if we put aside for a moment the definition by statistical qualification, by which of course you'll say India is urbanizing very, very fast, but frankly in terms of a mindset, in terms of the way we use space, our notions are definitely doubtful. The aim and the ambition in life was an acre, a house, and a cow. That was the aim of everyone. The city and the urban seemed a distant, kind of an illusion to begin with, and maybe something that one aspires, but probably not easy to get to. But I think it was driven well in their head that unless you become urban, you cannot progress in life, as was quite clearly stated. Even the Nehruvian idea of modern was, he had no faith in the villages, and I think that where the contrast between the Gandhian idea and the Nehruvian idea came in. And so for Nehru, it was the construction of the dams for energy, the steel plants, and the resulting industrial towns. But there was nothing about cities that he had really did anything, nor did he have faith in the village. Chandigarh was, rather than a city planning exercise, it was more an expression of what modern ought to be. I think getting in the kind of architect and what it stands for, rather than a place for people to inhabit really. Now, what breaks this linearity is you start wondering how do you explain such things? So the Jallikattu incidents, very recent, and you start wondering suddenly what seemed to be going on a track to say India is developing, is progressing, is modernizing, and you get events like this. And this is what I'm referring to say, and this is where I refer to also V.S. Naipaul had written in early 60s a book called An Area of Darkness. That's what he referred to India. And in 1990, he wrote a book called A Million Mutinies Now. And I think just the transition or the change from what he saw that India could not be labeled, or rather he thought that India has no identity and there's a need to label it which he cannot grasp it, and later realized that the million mutinies now is impossible for anyone to identify what actually India is and what seems to be surfacing from any part of the country. And that is enough to send this entire process into a tizzy where you really wonder, where are we moving? And I think that is, as I told you, a constant happening. So I'm going to go very quickly. There can be many, including this Jallikattu, yes. But also Jallikattu was much more than just a bullfight. It was also so much of Tamilian pride, the Tamilian identity, the youth. There's so many issues involved with a lot of such incidents. The cow now suddenly becomes a center of attraction. A number of issues, I'm sure you're aware of the cow now. And the camels in Pushkar, which have been decreasing. Also, I refer to a book by Ravi Sundaram. He calls Pirate Modernity. The book is called Pirated, and he refers to the media culture. And he refers to the pirate modernity in the sense that US was very concerned that India, Nehru Place, is one of the world's largest grey market for computer software and all the hardware and the peripherals and everything to do with it. And what is important to realize that Nehru Place was never meant to be a single commodity market. It was 1970s, the Delhi Development Authority wanted to decentralize and came up with a mixed use idea of the centers was that. But what transformed from that kind of an idea was a single commodity market wherein every sort of crevice, let's say, of that entire development, there was some activity or other to do with the media. So this is the transformed Nehru Place, and the whole idea therefore of the bazaar, which was sort of ignored by the British as a medieval or a Mughal sort of a key element, had to accept that bazaar is still there, and the idea of Connaught Place, which was a concentrated market, a single place, and British never believed in this kind of a linear spread of a market. Suddenly this was staring right in the front of to say that bazaar is there to stay and is a very much an integral part of it. And second, the idea of illegality versus legal. You have all the famous, whether it is the Reliance or Tata, who offer you the cable network, but simultaneously you have the local cable guy who will come and give you other channels. Now both operate. And same thing here. So this idea of the simultaneity of the two kind of idea of what is modern is there and becomes very difficult for us to therefore decide what is it to be modern. Including self-indulgence, the shift from a shared, if you wanted to get over guilt, then you had chocolate, you need to share it so that you feel less guilty about it. So right from an ad which said, kuch meetha ho jaye, was a family event and Wahida Rahman robs the chocolate, moves on to now this slurping kind of thing. I don't want any company, I don't have to share chocolate. Is a self-indulgence. And whether it is the idea of a mobile phone now, the shift from a shared to a self-indulgence, self-becoming important, I think this is again an idea of modernity, which again would reflect in a lot of the social values. And as I told you, I'm no social scientist, but I had to create a ground, maybe with sweeping generalities, to be able to further address what urban design would be. So Indian city, as I mentioned earlier, referred to chaotic, messy, but we say it is spontaneous and is also vibrant. So this is the kind of representation of that. And to counter that, what British came up was master plans. Master plans were meant to regulate, were control, were supposed to get in order, and were supposed to get in beauty. My take on this is that they're imposed, they're abstract, and they're unreal. This is true for any city. This is of Ahmedabad, but typically the old core would be a red blob, which where they'll say nothing can be done about it. Till JNNERM came up with an idea saying, what is urban renewal? We had a lot of people, government officers running to SEP to ask what is this urban renewal? We have never heard. For us, planning meant outward expansion and virgin lands. And I think this is important for me to state here that the conventional urban planning is based on a positivist attitude which likens design to physical science. It assumes that planners, by the virtue of the training, have risen above the non-initiated and have developed exceptional, mystical, and clever data collecting ability, and by which they claim that they are superior to everyone else and they can make plans because they know better than all of you. These abilities, is argued, enable them to describe the existing reality closer to perfection and as a result generate more valid judgments for design interventions. So it is with this kind of an arrogance that they go ahead and do this master planning. The above ideology gives rise to a belief in centralized and hierarchical decision making, theory of probability, oversimplification, contention with an overview, abstraction, city as an economic space, and historic code is seen as an unresolvable problem. And Jane Jacobs has also written quite a bit on these lines. And therefore, once I consider land as a commodity, the geography comes to an end. You don't need geography because any depression in land is seen as an aberration. And if you want to be sensitive to the lay of the land and therefore the pattern of development you have to consider in the app. So they become, the pits become the favorite disposal area for the garbage dumping for the municipal corporations. And as a result, you have, whether it's Bombay or Ahmedabad, you land up with flooding, then saying that we didn't want water here, but unfortunately that's what the reality is. And also in an attempt to redevelop and bring order, what's called an ordered abstract planning. You know, urban space has been defined in planners' language as the terminology they use is center and suburb, low and high density, congestion and speculation. There are no architectural idea to this whole thing. So planning, which started under the Ministry of Health, ironically treats human beings as numbers and urban space as a percentage. That's the method of control. The Nariman Point was 1960s, was promised as the most ordered development. I think I've got a signal, so I need to, I'll touch upon main concept and I'll rush through so that I just build the base. Okay. Problem of human being. Later, P.K. Das and all, they came up and they won the competition. Entire strategy was how to pedestrianize the place, link Nariman Point with the waterfront, and how to incorporate human activity. Right? These are the kind of images that they made. 1970-91, Bombay Metro, the regional plan for Bombay. From this is the extract, which shows on the left that a guided development should be like this, and a haphazard urban development ought to be like this, with images saying Bombay the beautiful is no longer beautiful. The idea of beauty is the Art Deco, the late Baroque, of coherence, of form being uniform, and anything which seems messier is obviously not beautiful. So please note what I was trying to say, the notions of what is modern and therefore what is beautiful and what is ordered. This continues even till today. About a year or two back, when the Chinese president had come to Ahmedabad, the first AMC declared the slums to be hidden. So all slums were covered with these huge hoardings to see that slums are not seen. Next time when the vibrant Gujarat was there, not only slums went off, but after hawkers were removed and the dogs and the cows also were removed. Okay, so the hawkers were asked to stop business. I mean, our idea of beauty, and this same thing happened in Commonwealth Games in Delhi. So our idea of beauty and what a city and what, therefore what is modernity, we are still hung up with the same notions of that is modern, and therefore we all aspire towards it. A model street Ahmedabad which was developing, the past was here and the present is that. It was to be cleaned off. So this is not allowed, or this has to be masked. Dhaka Capital Complex, these are also satirical sketches by Perez de Arc, shows how the sort of the poorly scaled public spaces ought to be rescaled. Conventional planning idea of it being attractive as a production facility, hinterlands, supplies the raw material. But what is important I want to mention is the idea of a green belt, and to limit the idea of the town. And in Ahmedabad, you try and go and try and find out where the green belt is, you won't find it. But India had not a limited kind of a peripheral growth, it had a network. And so you have two plans, one is Kanchipuram and one is Thodaimandapuram, where the network extended beyond the urban core and the temple core. Naya Raipur, one example I give, and what I want to quote in this particularly is when I spoke to the former chairman of the Naya Raipur Development Authority, that Naya Raipur should provide all that Raipur does not have. That was what it said. And it was not needed, but because of new state, and therefore a new capital, a new image, and therefore new modernity. So Raipur and Naya Raipur are seen as dichotomous: chaotic versus regulated, mundane versus spectacle, traditional versus modern, integrated versus segregated, piecemeal versus end-state prescriptions, and so on. So even today, people from Raipur go to Naya Raipur in the evening to have a good breeze and eat something and come back. But it's a spectacle. I'll skip this, how I wanted to demonstrate through Raipur how the imposition of a grid was totally, and even the villages which were being engulfed were appropriately not addressed. The idea of a neighborhood, I don't know where they get this idea of neighborhood. 2004 is not very much back in the history. Typical of a central green space with all the community spaces, schools, and the shopping centers constituting the corner. Believe 1929, this person called Perry had already given a diagram of the neighborhood. And 2004, after almost, 74 years, we are still trying to create the same neighborhood. So as if last 65 years, there has been no learning. And we're repeating the same idea of what we consider as modern. So the roads became barriers. There was no interaction. And so done by one of the students, can communities claim back the crossings? Because each neighborhood was literally like a fortress. But you talk of porosity, the figure ground obviously it only tells you black and white, doesn't tell you about porosity. Nolly did a little better. But in the Indian case, we have gradation of public realm. And Jaipur is a good example where one sample of the central palace square shows on the past, which was an impregnable fortification kind of an attitude, to something which seeps in, the public realm seeps into this whole thing. And the public edge, which is made continuous on the ground floor, steps leading on the temple, which is kept at the back as against creating dead walls. So the idea of graded public space and public realm is, I think, is an absolutely important point I'm trying to make here, whether it's Ahmedabad, this is in the south. So thresholds, and what I call important is borrowed from Kenneth Frampton to say the space of public appearance is the way a building would now respond to a negotiated edge. There might be small gestures which, if we forget, we do not recognize the public. Temporary of territoriality and urban space, the public and the various variations within the public realm in the Indian context. It could be even quiet and serene. It doesn't have to be busy and big crowds. And the characters which impinge on the Indian cities are migration, rule book versus reality, image versus reality, simultaneity, sustainability, local versus global, part and the whole, chaos versus control, and importantly, cyclical notion of time. We need to recognize the particularities of Indian migration, seasonal, daily, and these are the kind of scenarios from Calcutta. So we use public space and street to do everything. We live there, we cook there, we have a bath. Everything happens onto the street. It cannot be a stratified, isolated stream for traffic movement alone. So you start wondering what is really urban in which case. Bombay, land so precious. You have the Dhobi Ghats, you have the Tabela still there. We have now a bill in 2012 which recognizes street vendors and is a parliamentary act. You cannot wish them away. They are part of the street. So the kind of a fluctuating street space, contested claims on how much of space, activities is all a matter of continuous adjustment. That's why I use the word flux. So again, as I said, they sell, they live, including cows want to occupy, High Court, no one will listen to them. We have the rule book versus reality. India has some of the best laws, high-minded laws, but extremely poor in implementation. So we have the Great Indian Safari, and importantly, Gujarat, Rajasthan, the other states also, which come up with Gujarat Regularization of Unauthorized Development Act. There's an act to regularize an unauthorized thing. I mean, can you imagine that? So we have a rule book, and then we say it has to be something. And this is happening. This is Rajasthan. This is Gujarat. Bombay came up with recently existing land use plan. This shows the number of discrepancies in the existing land use plan. So you can imagine what the actual scene is and what the plan said. And as an example, the JJ School of Architecture is shown as commercial. Okay, they as you see the numbers marked. Now we all aspire as in India that we want to aspire global models. We come up with all this international business district, corporate headquarters, chain restaurants, signature architecture, and Disneyfied localities of tourism. But we also have poverty, we have slums, we have overcrowding, we have poor infrastructure, informal economies, archaic management structure, corruption, etc. So for us, development cannot be catching up with the global West, but we have to aspire to understand our realities which emerge from or evolve from our conditions, and therefore to define what can urban design be. Reality versus image, this is not a video game, but actual projection by a developer in Bangalore who said what Bangalore ought to be looking like. So now we have Singapore has been displaced by Shanghai as the new modern. So if you want to be modern, Bombay has to be, so many times all ministers have said Bombay should become Shanghai. And so these continuous things without really understanding that they are only image making exercises. The ground realities is below the flyovers and all the infrastructure we create. We have the kind of virtual markets, all the traditional informal economy is still valid. So image making, Hong Kong continues, they become backdrop for taking selfies. And Hong Kong also now talks about segregated movement. So it is called a city with no ground. You move either above or you move below the ground. And so Indian politicians or bureaucrats would tend, or even architects, let's say, would try and aspire that to be modern, you need to have a skywalk. So Bombay is full of skywalks, because if you don't have a skywalk, your city is not modern, is not world city, and obviously not a smart city. So this becomes an ingredient, but they have done it very carefully, and the entire thing has been worked out. Of course, the streets are dead. It overlooks things like this, the street dead. Image making, we have to market now our towns. So we have Narendra Modi with all the other visuals to attract, but it is not a naturally attractive place for people to be in. It has been induced. So whenever a minister comes, water from Narmada river is put into that, because it's not a perennial river, it's a lake. And water is there to impress the visiting dignitaries. The question is that the right model? Alienated slums, this is what one thought it would to be, this is what it was. Some ecologically sensitive suggestions which were made earlier as an academic exercise. This continues, the gift in Ahmedabad, not a single building is going to look like this, is not coming up like this exactly. But this is one what is to be sold. So there are also posters near the airport, buildings India's first smart city before the vibrant Gujarat. And it goes now to Amravati also, where they hired Singapore architects to create. So they create the images, but recently, I don't know what came up to Chandrababu Naidu, the chief minister. He said there should be a Telugu touch to the whole thing, and therefore let's hire the director of Bahubali film to give an idea of, add the Telugu touch to it. I mean, that is the kind of image making to our cities. Can you imagine that this is not a Lego? Huh? And I want to stress on this quality a lot, simultaneity, which I think is very, very peculiar in the Indian conditions, that everything happens. If you read from the Hindu myths, each myth celebrates the belief that universe is boundlessly various, that everything occurs simultaneously, that all possibilities may exist without excluding anything else. I think that's a very important quality. So you watch TV and you have these sensex strips going along, your mind is comfortable doing both. One could be the most ritualistic, and the other is a hardcore money-making exercise. Your mind is not disturbed, and I think that simultaneity is extremely important for the mindset. Bombay, as an example, how the principles of the access, the center, but yet simultaneity in terms of Bombay, the core is not only commercial, it has residential. And the symbols both of the Gothic and the most poorest form of economy of street trading happens as a juxtaposition. Symbols of the Maharashtra freedom, the Flora fountain, the MNCs with the Dabbawalas, the image of the Ballad estate and the Baroque principles of space organization, living, working, industry, nothing is segregated. Plan says zoning, but I think nothing works as a zoning. Everything is simultaneous. This simultaneous, this is enmeshed, as against the African cities, here they're much more closer. The kind of disparities, but they're extremely enmeshed. That's the kind of texture you get of the city, the activities, the wholesale and the retail markets. Jaipur, Johri Bazaar, the same street has the namaz on Eid. And what is important, we also now talk smart cities being modern. What is important is we need diversity and choice, and open and unpredictable. We don't want central monitoring stations. And I think if we're nothing against technology, but I think there has to be, people have to matter in the decisions making. City, Bombay, is it a melting pot or a salad bowl? And I have been saying it's a salad bowl, the mix of, after a point it refuses to mix. So samples in Chembur, where you have the South Indian population, your global versus local, you don't know whether you're moving ahead or not. Is more worn like a badge or as an identity rather than the theology between the belief of that. We have a very famous diagram of the Vastu Purusha. This is the Vishnu who claims that all the world is with him, and what is important is a non-linear relationship between all parts of the body, which converts to all the four varnas, that they are all interdependent and not hierarchical. And so therefore the part in the whole relationship becomes extremely important in the Indian condition. So the blind men, the six blind men of Hindustan and the elephant, talks about the need for integration and to not be arrogant of touching a part and pretending to know the whole. So the idea of back and forth of whole and part, integration of various departments, it could be government departments or anything, is extremely critical. Jaipur does wonderfully well of the part and whole, of the kind of logics between neighborhood, individual residences. Then as a scale didn't matter. People think you can keep on growing and it doesn't matter. And so we apply the same symbols to cities as we apply to the dresses, SML, XL, so small, medium, large, extra large, extra large. So the cities also use exactly the same terminology, not realizing there's a difference in grain size and the texture. So Schumacher is no longer valid. We have now mall is beautiful, small is no longer beautiful. You need much larger grain sizes. And even Hong Kong is going through this kind of thing of a podium and towers, replacing the smaller grains. Tiruchirappalli, same thing happening. The impact on the street as a result. The textures, the fine grain becomes critical, and therefore the economic activities of the fine grain is very contributive to making of a proper urban settlement. The Bazaar Street in Jaipur again is a fantastic demonstration of how you have compact in the vicinity of working together, well segregated, streets aligned with indicating the public nature of the spaces, recognizing the processional activities, yet order, and within an order the variations. Mixed use and compact. This is exactly what smart city is talking. Occupancies of work-in, live-in places, the fantastic network economies of the Dabbawalas is one example, but there are many such examples. This one thing I want to emphasize on our notion of time is cyclical as against the Western notion which is linear. So, Curzon, who had come with the ASI, Archaeological Survey of India, and we still know that it doesn't really work. Conservation is still not in our blood. We'd rather reuse a stone from an ancient monument to rebuild our house rather than mummifying or trying to curate a particular structure. So we have the Hindu triad of Vishnu, Brahma, Mahesh, who believe creation, maintenance and devastation is a constant recycling. Ignorance of that results into all kinds of problems. Choices between chaos versus control. So do we want a sterilized, well-controlled environment, or we say it's okay to say that this much of chaos is okay. Pune boasts about street corners, people reading newspapers is a community activity. You have what's called as a Sarvajanik Vanchanalaya, is a common place where people can just pick up a newspaper and read. This is not part of a master plan. Bombay DN Road does very well of individual variations within a framework. The point of recently, the Aam Aadmi is rising up. There is at least more lip service, if not totally implemented, of that a common man is becoming important. People must become the subjects of the verb of development and not the objects, the doers and not the done for. Every person can and must have an opportunity to take part. Planning is not as mystical as it's made to sound. And so if you want development, I think the question of identifying the right strategies, seeing that it evolves from our needs is important. So in cases where people have been ignored, Badr Plaza, recent entire scheme was done as, again, one more renaissance of idea of coherence, but it didn't work out. But you ignore the people, it doesn't work. Same thing happened with the riverfront. This is how the recent, about how displaced pay with lives for city's pride. This was about the relocation problems in the riverfront project. City cannot afford not to be inclusive. It has to accommodate, and cities have to be just. Urban design then has 4 areas in the Indian circumstances. One is where one like Mayawati, self-proclaiming and self-propagating the uprise of the Dalits is an important thing in the movement of what we call as modernity, the uprising of the individual. But then we have these kind of Lavasa, gated, the way he was referring, restricted in terms of access, oasis, concentration of wealth as demonstration of development. Then we have places like GIFT, which is again totally based on more of a business model rather than architecture or city living. That are the 4 kind of broad areas for urban design in Indian circumstances today. The answer lies in fragmentation and order, and Jaipur plan to me is a fantastic example. And so for urban design, what we have to do is a mediating between architecture and planning in the public realm, multidisciplinary interface, holistic, integrative. It has to be catalytic, a process, a framework, cannot be a one-time act. Public policy, inclusive, economically viable, socially responsible, and environmentally sustainable. Urban design is a primary interface between technology and people. So what we need is radical ideas, something that are emerged from our understanding of our own society and not something that we borrowed with what I call as unabashed mimicry of Singapore, Hong Kong or Shanghai. So we need holistic, integrative, pluralistic, mixed use, fine grained, accommodative, mutative, not prescriptive, evolving not at a time. This is the last slide. So the question is, in this kind of a flux, how do you act? Because every time you want to act, there are 5 problems which crop up and say you cannot do it because it's not right. So what I said is, we have to develop or rather get rid of this idea of getting hold of the whole and labeling and sort of segregating. But instead what we say is that there is anarchy and there is limitless randomness, and as I said, it can be called chaos. But there is pluralism which cannot be reduced. Beyond a point, you just cannot simplify it. It has to remain plural, it has to be contradictory. And to handle the crisis, it requires freedom to play with uncertainties without having to impose established certainties. And this simultaneously requires a thinking process more capable of dissolving certain attitudes of categorization while creating the clarity so as to replace the for categorized structures. So it's like a kingfisher waiting for an opportunity to dive, may not get the fish, but takes the plunge, comes out, it fails. But I think one has to take the plunge. Yet answers can be sought without recourse to building a nest or laying foundation. It is like stopping in midair, realizing sensation of being suspended, yet convinced that one will not collapse. Thus one pushes the state of suspension and demands answers in the middle of the sky. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you.
I promise to talk exactly 20 minutes. I'm going to give a presentation that does connect to both of the prior two, but I'm coming at the subject from the standpoint of a historian. So much of what I'm going to be talking about is based on historical research and historical documents, but especially with PVK's presentation just now, I think my comments will connect with that whole rural-urban idea. And what I want to suggest is there's a genealogy or a heritage of urban design thinking that we maybe have lost sight of. And this is a little effort to pull it out of the library stacks for a moment, just to reconsider it. So I'm going to make 2 basic points. I'm going to argue that urban design in India developed substantially out of concerns about India's rural conditions, out of concerns about what was going on in the countryside. And secondly, that the intellectual genealogy of urban design in South Asia is unusually diverse, more so, in fact, than most urban design professions across the world, combining as it does insights from economics, sociology, engineering, architectural design, biology, and many other fields, including agrarian science. So as I say, my suggestion is to let's revisit this trend of urban design as it forms into a discipline in the middle of the 20th century. Well, my first argument may seem paradoxical, namely urban design thinking in 20th century India depended importantly on changes in the Indian countryside. The short version, and one that PVK has already touched on, is that in an earlier period, colonial period, the world of the village was seen as completely separate from the world of the city. Neither seemed to be able to contribute much to the other. By the turn of the 20th century, particularly right after First World War, rapid urbanization forced people to entertain the implications of there being a kind of sliding scale between the village and the city. So the city and the village become conjoined by about 1915. Scholars from the new field of rural sociology began theorizing the effects of urbanization on rural communities beginning in the 1920s in India. And by the 1930s, the term urbanization was used to describe the interpenetration of urban and rural cultures and economies. By the early 1950s, ethnographers had cataloged a long list of urban influences in villages and developed several theories to explain them. Once seen as distinct and independent milieus, the countryside and the city became joined conceptually as endpoints on a continuum, right around the middle of the 20th century. So that intellectual transformation took about 30 to 40 years. Now, there were a number of rural processes that prompted a rethinking of the connections between urban and rural economies, societies, and landscapes. And let me single out just a couple. Monetization of the rural economy and effect of agriculture's market orientation, which began in the 19th century and was more or less complete by the early 20th century, was blamed for increasing debt among farmers and the consequent explosion of a market in rural land. And since rural credit was almost always secured through a lien on land, defaulted loans delivered agricultural land into the hands of a money-lending class that was routinely described as urban, whether or not they actually were. Of course, we know there were a lot of rural moneylenders as well. In addition, custom was seen to exacerbate this problem by authorizing what experts claimed was an irrational division of land. Across many parts of India, land is passed on by apportioning equal shares among a deceased's heirs. Custom dictates that each heir should receive not just a share of the land in total, but a comparable proportion of both good and bad land. This meant that holdings, which were already reduced in size through multiple partitions by succeeding generations, were split into areas of differing qualities, often in plots that were physically separated from one another. And this shows 10 different cultivators' holdings spread across the range of the village itself, some in tiny, tiny fields, if you will. Sociologist Radha Kamal Mukherjee wrote in his 1920 treatise on rural economy, so already by 1920, people are taking note of this. I quote, "The Indian cultivator's farm tends to fly into fragments and grows steadily smaller and less regular." In 1930, Malcolm Darling, an ICS officer in the Punjab, described a village in the Jalandhar district with 12,800 acres splintered into 63,000 fields. Another village in Jalandhar where 580 owners cultivated 16,000 fields, whose mean size was only 1/7 of an acre. So fragmentation and the resulting miniaturization of fields was both economically bad and a source of unceasing disputes out of court and litigation in the court. Since, as one deputy registrar put it, it was nearly impossible to drive a plow in such fields without committing a trespass. This may seem a long ways from urban design, but I'll try to tie it back together. Now, many at the time saw the fragmentation of holdings and the uneconomic plots that resulted as a catalyst driving the most vulnerable agriculturalists off the land and into India's cities. Agrarian debt, by transforming wealth to urban agencies and pushing a rural underclass into the city, thus linked rural and urban domains together in a very concrete fashion. There were some solutions taken. This is another city in the Punjab where most of my research has been based. And this is the city originally planned, and then I'll show you what happens after it's been so-called consolidated. Land consolidation was designed to convert every landholder's scattered and uneconomic plot into a single contiguous block of land, equivalent in value and quality to the original, if not always in actual area. This entailed complicated mapping and exchange of land among owners, same village, payment of compensation in cases where the revised holding had less market value than the original, describing and recording the new rights, the new proprietary rights in the land, and handling the massive objections, appeals, and infractions that went along with these things in the courts. A number of other measures were also folded into land consolidation, however, and these do indeed come out of town planning discourse directly, including the provision of straight paths, fixed boundary markers, circular roads around the village abadi. The abadi is the place where the houses of the village are, and provision of common areas for cremation grounds, schools, latrines, playgrounds, and so forth. Another set of rural concerns were more social in nature, and this has to do with the perception of decline in villages more generally. In addition to pushing workers off the land, bad conditions in the countryside raised the fear that the most talented people were leaving in troubling numbers to establish careers in India's towns and cities. Hubert Calvert, a member of the 1928 Royal Commission on Agriculture, argued that the chief evil confronting rural areas was the steady, persistent withdrawal from agriculture of the more intelligent and enterprising youths in the countryside. People weren't able to make a living with plots scattered around like that, even landholders. And of course, in a lot of villages, there were a lot of landless workers as well. So this is creating a kind of trend move into the city, and people are beginning to take notice. Rural Reconstruction and Village Uplift were two programs that played a significant role in responding to this fear, beginning in the 1920s. Frank Brain's experiments in Gurgaon, where he was district commissioner during the late 1920s, initiated a lasting template for bringing rural reconstruction and uplift activity under the framework of colonial local government. Following his work in Gurgaon, which he undertook largely on his own initiative, Brain was made Commissioner of Rural Reconstruction of the Punjab, a post that several other provincial governments would inaugurate during the 1930s. In post-independent India, Albert Mayer, an American architect, town planner, and military officer, worked with Nehru to design India's community development schemes, and he used Brain's earlier work as his basic model. Village Uplift focused on replanning the village abadi as an architectural proposition and as planned social space. Plans for individual villages had to be coordinated with plans for nearby villages so that approach roads and linking lanes were constructed in the right orientation. As far as possible, new holdings were to be regular in shape, mostly rectangular. Spatial metaphors of interconnectivity and rationalization predominated, with a special emphasis placed on the provision of logical road and internal path networks, separating fields from residences, animals from people, and so forth and so on. Alterations to the existing built fabric were designed to be gradual rather than rapid, making improvements here and there as opportunities arose. In this regard, village planning owed a considerable debt to many of the principles popularized by town planner Patrick Geddes in his several studies of Indian cities. More generally, rural reconstruction was designed to take the advantages of urban settings, community meetings, organized sports, or as in this case, a community radio listening scheme from the 1930s, and bring them out into the villages to make the village a more likely place for talented youths to want to stay and develop their own profession. Agriculture starts to be called a profession around the 1920s and 1930s with the coming into play of agricultural colleges. The earliest institutional form that this kind of physical formatting took was that of civic design in England, which eventually comes to be called here and elsewhere town and country planning. I think we're familiar with those terms. The University of Liverpool took the lead under the direction of Patrick Abercrombie, and in 1910, they published the first volume of the Town Planning Review Quarterly, which regularly published essays and studies on city development in India. If you want to read interesting stuff about your city, go get that journal. And it begins publishing from 1910, and I believe it's still being published. There's a lot of good information in there. Training in town planning lagged very considerably in India, despite an increasing awareness of the need to address this rapidly urbanizing population. Kerala entered the game fairly early, passing a limited planning bill in 1923. Mysore, Madhya Pradesh, and Punjab all had town planning departments around that time that assisted municipalities in drafting and executing local schemes, but most cities relied on improvement trusts, whose work was largely limited to street widening and slum clearance. So there was no comprehensive sense of planning in India. In fact, in 1947, at the time of independence, there were fewer than 40 qualified town planners in the entire country, and no postgraduate programs at all in town planning. The oldest program in town planning was started at Bengal Engineering College in 1949, where a 2-year course led to a postgraduate diploma. Provisions were made subsequently in the 5-year plans for expanding existing institutions to train town planners. By 1957, 3 schools offered degrees: Bengal Engineering College, the IIT Delhi, and School of Town and Country Planning of Delhi. And in 1955, when the School of Town and Country Planning begins, they also initiate a journal, and the title of the journal is Urban and Rural Planning Thought. So the urban and the rural are well sealed together by this time, by the middle of the 20th century. Together, these 3 programs turned out 15 graduates a year. So again, there's a real shortage of people with town planning experience immediately post-independence. In 1957, Bihar, with a population of 40 million people, had only 2 qualified planners in the entire state. Calcutta, the industrial capital, with a population at that time of about 5 million people, had no planning agency and no qualified planner at all on its urban staff. So as I said at the beginning, this was a profoundly interdisciplinary group of people. The people that, I've already mentioned people's names like Geddes, who was a sociologist and a town planner, Radha Kamal Mukherjee, who was a sociologist. The town planning movement itself, as it was called in the early 20th century, was indebted, of course, to Ebenezer Howard, who was an accountant and who helped found the Garden City movement. I think he's familiar enough, we don't need to talk about him. Howard's ideas were promoted very vigorously in India by Patrick Geddes, who was a biologist, town planner, environmental sociologist, who wrote over 50 town planning reports for municipalities across India from 1914 through 1919, and I think this is the Raja Holkar, perhaps, of Indore State. During the First World War, Geddes collaborated with Radha Kamal Mukherjee, a sociologist based in Lucknow, who helped establish the intellectual basis of what was called urban ecology. So there were all these urban ecology studies being done in the 40s. And Mukherjee, in an article that he published in 1932 in the American Journal of Sociology, called for the establishment of a new urban movement comprised of systematizers in the diverse fields of economics, agriculture, entomology, biochemistry, and epidemiology. He was also a frequent contributor to the Indian Journal of Economics, and H. Stanley Jevons at Lucknow, who ran that journal. All of these guys were working together. We talk about interdisciplinarity in our universities these days. Go back 60, 70, 80 years, and I think you will find that that interdisciplinary milieu was even more robust than it currently is. Let me skip forward a little bit. I should have been showing you that. That's a worth reading book, 1946. He wrote maybe 30 books, and they're fascinating, all to do about man and his environment, and there's a sort of organic sensibility about cities and so forth. By the 1950s and the 1960s, literally hundreds of sociological and ethnographic studies had been carried out on Indian villages, most of them near large cities, and most of them demonstrating how intimately connected most villages were to urban economies and processes. These sociological and anthropological studies were a key component of urban design training and practice. Indeed, village studies became a common thesis topic in schools of planning and architecture across the country. Now, all of these things were developed piecemeal in various contexts and at different scales, but what's remarkable is how stable the forms that resulted came by the middle of the 20th century. In 1926, Radha Kamal Mukherjee again described a possible future for the entire Gangetic region. And I quote, "Almost one continuous series of garden cities with their tributary farms, where the advantage in transport afforded by waterways would be utilized in the redistribution of industrial and manufacturing cities to ensure our living with the least waste of effort. Factories and industrial establishment would meet surplus labor of the overcrowded farms halfway in towns and small cities." So there's a sort of integration of the rural and the urban already in the 1920s, and he's imagining it almost as though one is flying over the countryside and looking down on this thing that all the little pieces exist, but someone needs to put it together. These are images that would still fit comfortably in debates about urbanization going on in India today. As with the following scheme, which I will show you some images of. New Home is a planned integrated rural-urban development encompassing over 3 million acres in Uttar Pradesh. The scale and comprehensiveness of its conception are vast. It comprises a curving swath of agricultural land from 20 to 30 miles wide and over 200 miles long, stretching from Hardoi in the north to Jaunpur in the south, neatly bisected by the Sai River. The core of the scheme is an expansive, low-rise, decentralized modern city linked to scores of model agricultural villages via state-of-the-art rail and communications infrastructure. The city itself, simply called Modern City, is a rhomboidal mass stretching 21 miles in its longest dimension, from the outskirts of Lucknow in the east to the hinterland of Kanpur in the west, encompassing an area of some 115 square miles, which is almost roughly the size of Chennai. The city is partitioned into polygonal blocks by long radial alleys stretching towards infinity that intersect to form a network of rond points, squares, and other Baroque urban figures in a manner reminiscent of the palace grounds of Versailles. I'm just almost finished. The city is arrayed symmetrically along both sides of a central rail line and divided into largely self-contained neighborhood units, each with its own symmetrical array of residential, commercial, and recreational spaces focused on a square park-like void at the center. The scheme's private promoters, citing the twin pressures of urban overcrowding and insufficient employment in rural areas, emphasize planned interlinkages between rural and urban economies, civic amenities, and with an even distribution of schools, hospitals, playgrounds, libraries, and factories for the manufacture of essential goods. In both scale and comprehensiveness, the New Home scheme in UP dwarfs most other public-private, township, and rural development schemes in South Asia currently today, from the rapid development of the Delhi-Lucknow corridor, or the new township development of Magarpata, owned and built and operated by the prosperous sugarcane farming Magar community near Pune, to the integration of biotechnology, industrial estates, and luxury communities in Gujarat being pushed by the current government, to a whole host of smart city schemes that others in this audience can describe far better than I can. It also predates all those schemes by over 60 years, because New Home was planned in 1950, actually by a group of partition refugees who had come over from Pakistan. So I present it here as a sort of a clear example of the presence of an aesthetic proposition that tightly integrates rural and urban formats, a proposition that remains current, but that cohered through a longer history, I think, than we sometimes imagine. I suggest, therefore, that many lessons may lie in an exploration of the recent past by understanding how the field of urban design coalesces in essence. I'll stop there. I've already gone over. I broke my promise. Thanks.
Okay. Whoa. All right. So while they're setting up the stage for us to talk, I'm just gonna. Yeah. Can we turn the lights off, please? Okay. Good. Okay. So that's my first. I'll have one question and then we go. So how do you find the role of? In the future of urban design, the role of humanities happening today? You were mentioning Jane Jacobs. William, you have a series of English planners that somehow went back on their head, once they are in the field. And you are somehow doing it on your own. And you made an analysis of empty spaces, urban spaces that operate in this kind of way. What is the role of the humanities there? That's one question. And second is the role of nature, which was mentioned yesterday by Minister Naidu, which I find slightly in contradiction between the urban design and the role of nature. I would like to, the role of nature. He was telling very openly that nature has to come to the city. What do you guys think about that?
Two questions.
Two questions, yeah.
Go ahead, I just spoke.
Okay, is it on?
Yeah, I just spoke.
Hello. Yeah.
Test.
I think I have had a bias a lot on the humanities for the simple reason. If you have referred to this term called critical regionalism, besides Kenneth Frampton, the others also, or Alexander Zones, who also was referring to this. And one of the books recently was about peaks and valleys in a globalized world. The point being referred to was that the differences, so the world is not flat. So in spite of globalization, where does the particularities start stemming in, and I think that could be attributed, besides the lay of the land or the climatic considerations, is the people and the culture. And so, and that is enough to make a difference to something becoming homogeneous all across the world. And the moment urban design reduces to a business plan, I think that's where the danger is. So humanities is a fantastic counter check to be able to see that it can be made to work. Is not to say that cities should not be profitable, but it has to be, as the people have to be in the center. And I think that humanities plays an immense role to be able to bring the focus or keep the focus continuously on the human being.
I do believe that that humanities forms the sort of norm, at my level, if, when I'm trying to negotiate this across, somebody who comes with all the economic arguments, that becomes the way in which you negotiate. In fact, with, the backing of humanities, you're talking about, sociology, geography, history, all the connections one is making is in fact to counter the single argument that comes in of valuations. So yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely imperative that the connection remains, should remain.
I mean, I would just say, I mean, for me, humanities has a fairly technical meaning, and it's, it is precisely that list of liberal arts subjects that I find, at least in American schools of architecture, are increasingly getting less and less. When you imagine studying with somebody like a Geddes, you would be studying human reproduction. You would be studying waterborne disease. You would be studying all kinds of, he was quite spiritual, actually, in his framing of issues. So I think pedagogically, that is in the training of architects. I mean, I attended a couple of very interesting panels here that had to do with reconstructing buildings that had been demolished in an earthquake in Nepal. And I mean, the architectural solution there is very simple. It's not a technical solution. I mean, we could train everybody in this room how to design for earthquake resistance in a matter of half an hour. But the problems that they confronted as architects in these rebuilding schemes were social, they were cultural, they had to do with the history, they had to do with the way communities communicate with one another, how they fund their lives. And I don't think architectural education is giving us much training in those essential tasks. So I would encourage that pedagogically, humanities be brought prominently into the education of young architects.
I didn't touch it in my talk, but if you consider the Swachh Bharat scheme of the government, if you do not understand the notion of what is sacred, what is polluted, what is clean, no campaign can succeed. So it is not a number game to be able to say how many toilets have you put in, how many streets you got cleaned. I think I didn't sort of elaborate, but this whole idea of the bazaar, and I think a researcher called Dipendra Chakrabarti has written quite eloquently on the bazaar being so-called the outside. In India, normally when you say bazari aurat means, you're referring to a prostitute. So anything which was meant to be bazaar was meant to be outside. So the threshold was a point to govern. So the moment you talk about outside, so therefore your filth will always be outside, with no idea that the city has to be cleaned. Even though there were markers of the village or the town to protect themselves from the outside influences, but still the reduction of the understanding of the realm was reduced to essentially a household. And therefore the outside, and therefore the trash, the filth, including people who say, I'll blow my nose, is a better thing to do rather than blow it into a handkerchief, because they say it has to go out, and that's the purpose of cleaning yourself. So I think one has to, and that's where the humanities come into picture, to understand the anthropological, cultural significance and the notions of what is sacred and what is not, and therefore these schemes have to work in a certain way. In the absence of that simple thing, in Ahmedabad, the Hindu cleaners refused to clean the Muslim-dominated areas, saying their trash has non-vegetarian. Now, this doesn't come on records, but very fundamental. How do you deal and evolve schemes which are going to be successful? I think humanities is where the answers would lie, of a better understanding of the ground realities and the people's perceptions.
So I'll have one more. There was a lot of also discussion about fragmentation and chaos as something that, in fact, we may see as a positive. There are positive aspects, even though it was seen as a negative aspect by the colonizers, right? So I'm wondering, again, anybody can jump in. Where would be the point? What is the turning point? What would be the turning point for urban design to actually get intelligent enough to decolonize many of these processes? And is one of those, as you were saying, the dirt has been always seen as negative, colonizing, in fact. But is there a way to deal with with dirt as a piece of information, as something that can put us ahead, put the discipline ahead? Because again, as I said, urban design has this kind of almost ancient sounding to it, but it has a future as well. So the idea of what would be the point of decolonizing, is fragmentation one of those processes? Does it have to be controlled? I love your thing that you say that illegal settlements were made legal, meaning extra legal. I mean, that's a global phenomenon. So is that the turning point, allowing chaos to happen, or is it chaos anymore? Or do you think there will be another kind of a cycle of control of that chaos?
Okay, number of questions in yours. One, if I had to get to this idea of, if the photograph you showed of the Maharaja of the Holkar in Indore sitting with Patrick Geddes, interestingly, Patrick Geddes had taken out a procession through Indore streets, but it was done on the day of Dashera. So you see how he has linked the Sanitation Act to say that they'll pass through the streets which are the cleanest in the town. Well, it was for Dashera, where it is literally like spring cleaning.